It was an unusually warm evening in Stafford County in the late spring of 1986. The kind of night where the air felt heavy and still, and the usual hum of suburban life seemed muted as if nature itself held its breath. Jacqueline Lard, a young woman in her early 20s, had spent the day running errands and visiting friends, her life filled with simple routines and modest dreams. She had recently started a new job at a small accounting firm, a position that promised stability and the chance to move forward after a string of personal setbacks that had left her more cautious than most people her age. Jacqueline was the kind of person whose presence had a quiet light, not flashy but comforting. A reliable friend, a caring daughter, someone neighbors instinctively liked and trusted. That night, she returned home to her modest Stafford County house, a well-kept single-story home tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac lined with oaks and maples whose branches cast long, wavering shadows in the evening light. The street was familiar, friendly, and utterly safe, or so everyone believed. Jacqueline's routine was predictable, and that predictability made the events of that night all the more shocking. She cooked herself a simple dinner, then settled into the living room with a book she had been meaning to finish. The lights in the house were soft, casting a golden glow across the carefully arranged furniture, a contrast to the looming darkness of what would soon unfold. Her neighbors, winding down from their own evenings, had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. From outside, the house looked ordinary, quiet, and safe. There were no raised voices, no signs of struggle, no warning that a life was about to end so abruptly and violently. It was the next morning when the nightmare began to seep into Stafford County's consciousness. A neighbor, having noticed Jacqueline's mailbox overflowing and her curtains unmoved since the previous night, decided to check on her. The scene that greeted them was unimaginable. Jacqueline Lard had been murdered, and the discovery sent shockwaves through the small community. The details of the crime scene were both horrifying and perplexing. There were signs of struggle, but nothing that pointed to a specific suspect. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no footprints or fingerprints that clearly indicated who might have been responsible. It was as if the violence had come from nowhere, leaving only confusion, grief, and a trail that seemed to disappear before investigators could follow it. Police arrived quickly, securing the scene and beginning the painstaking process of piecing together what had happened. But from the start, it was clear that this case would not yield easy answers. Detectives working the case were seasoned, accustomed to dealing with property crimes, domestic disputes, and occasional violent incidents. But something about Jacqueline's murder unsettled even the most experienced officers. The violence had been precise, almost ritualistic, and yet there was no obvious motive. Robbery seemed unlikely as nothing of value had been taken. There was no evidence of a personal vendetta, at least none that could be immediately uncovered. Her friends and family were interviewed extensively, each providing alibis and memories that did little to illuminate the night's grim events. Yet, despite the lack of leads, the investigators could feel that there was a pattern hiding beneath the surface, subtle but unmistakable. This was not a random act of violence. There was method to the madness, a cruel intelligence behind the chaos that had claimed Jacqueline's life. As word spread, Stafford County became a community gripped by fear. The place that had once seemed serene and protected suddenly felt vulnerable. Parents began keeping a closer eye on their children. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about unknown strangers, and the streets that had always been safe felt strangely menacing. Jacqueline's friends struggled to reconcile the bright, energetic young woman they knew with the gruesome fate she had suffered. The tragedy seemed almost surreal, a horror that belonged in the pages of a crime novel rather than in their own backyards. Yet there it was, undeniable, and the sense of unease only grew as the investigation stalled. The killer seemingly vanished into thin air. Detectives scrutinized every detail of Jacqueline's life, from her workplace to her social circles, Her romantic relationships, even her daily routines. Each clue was analyzed with painstaking care. Each potential lead followed until it reached a dead end. The forensic tools of the time, while competent, offered limitations that made the investigation all the more frustrating. Fibers, hair samples, and fingerprints were collected, but they yielded nothing concrete. Witnesses were interviewed, but their accounts were often vague or contradictory. Every day brought mounting pressure on law enforcement to find answers. Yet the sense of despair grew as the days turned into weeks with no tangible progress. Jacqueline's family was left in the agonizing position of waiting, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. They struggled to understand why anyone would target her, someone so gentle and seemingly unthreatening. Her mother spent countless sleepless nights replaying every memory, every conversation, searching for something, anything, that could explain why her daughter's life had been stolen. Friends held vigils and tried to organize neighborhood watches, but the community's grief was only matched by its growing anxiety. Stafford County was changing. The quiet innocence of suburban life overshadowed by the realization that a predator had struck within their midst, and there was no clear way to stop them. Despite the lack of immediate leads, there were moments that hinted at a larger, more sinister reality. Neighbors reported fleeting glimpses of a suspicious vehicle near Jacqueline's home in the weeks leading up to her death. Details that seemed insignificant at first, but would later take on a troubling significance. Strangers had been seen in the neighborhood asking odd questions, lingering too long in public spaces. At the time, these incidents were dismissed as coincidence, the idle curiosity of passers-by. But for detectives who later revisited the case, these small observations formed pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, painted a picture of calculated intent. Someone had been watching, waiting, and planning. Jacqueline's murder was not an accident. It was the opening act of a story far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation stretched on, the sense of dread in Stafford County intensified. Residents grew wary, locking doors even during daylight, teaching their children to be cautious and viewing every unfamiliar face with suspicion. Jacqueline's death became a constant reminder that safety was an illusion, that even the most ordinary peaceful communities could be shattered in an instant. And for law enforcement, the case became a relentless pursuit, a challenge to uncover a killer who seemed to slip through their fingers at every turn. The feeling of being hunted, of trying to outsmart someone who had already thought several steps ahead, weighed heavily on those tasked with bringing justice to Jacqueline and her grieving family. In those early days, few could have predicted that Jacqueline's murder would not remain an isolated tragedy. The circumstances surrounding her death, unexplained, brutal, and methodical, hinted at a pattern that would only become clear years later. Stafford County was forever marked by that night, the night when normalcy shattered, leaving behind grief, fear, and a mystery that demanded answers. The life of Jacqueline Lard, stolen in its prime, became a silent witness to a darkness that had been lurking in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And though no one knew it at the time, the threads connecting Jacqueline's murder to events yet to unfold were already being spun, a web that would one day reveal the full extent of the horror hidden beneath the county's calm exterior. For months after Jacqueline Lard's murder, Stafford County existed in a strange limbo between grief and fear. Life continued on the surface, the schools remained open. The streets still carried the familiar rhythm of daily routines. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, the community was haunted by questions that had no answers. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones about strangers seen lingering at odd hours, and parents clutched their children a little tighter when walking home from school or practice. The sense of safety that had once defined the county was gone, replaced by a creeping anxiety that a predator was still out there, hidden, patient, and calculating. Jacqueline's friends and family were left in an endless loop of mourning and frustration, desperately searching for something tangible to hold on to, a clue that might finally break the case open. Detectives on the case worked tirelessly, chasing every lead, no matter how small or improbable. They spoke with colleagues, friends, and acquaintances, compiling timelines, cross-referencing alibis, and analyzing every minor detail of Jacqueline's life. Each interview offered a mixture of grief and frustration. Her co-workers described her as diligent and kind. Her friends recalled long nights spent laughing over coffee, and her family spoke of a young woman with dreams and ambitions that had yet to be realized. Yet amid these recollections, nothing seemed to explain the violence that had claimed her life. The more they investigated, the more the case felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, a mystery that grew darker and more complex with each passing day. Weeks turned into months, and the trail continued to grow cold. Evidence collected at the scene had been carefully preserved, yet forensic science in 1986 offered limited tools compared to modern methods. Fingerprints and fibers had been cataloged, photographs taken, but nothing pointed decisively to a suspect. Witnesses reported vague sightings. A car parked too long near Jacqueline's home, someone glimpsed through the trees late at night, a shadow that seemed out of place. But all of these turned out to be dead ends. Even the most promising leads dissolved under scrutiny, leaving detectives frustrated and exhausted. Stafford County began to fear that the case might never be solved, that Jacqueline's death would remain a haunting mystery, a cautionary tale of how quickly life could be stolen. During this period, the community's anxiety grew into vigilance. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight. Residents exchanged phone numbers to report unusual activity, and local businesses placed extra security measures. Despite these precautions, the fear never fully dissipated. Jacqueline's murder had left a permanent mark, a reminder that danger could come from the most unexpected places. Parents warned their children to be careful when walking alone. Friends hesitated before leaving one another's side, and the streets that had once felt safe now carried an invisible tension. Everyone knew that someone capable of such violence was still out there, blending into the fabric of daily life, waiting for the next opportunity. Amid this tense atmosphere, law enforcement began revisiting smaller details that initially seemed insignificant. Odd sightings from neighbors previously dismissed were now reconsidered. The detectives scrutinized records of suspicious activity in surrounding counties, looking for anything that might connect to Jacqueline's death. Slowly, patterns began to emerge, subtle at first but growing more distinct with each piece of corroborating evidence. It was as if someone had carefully planned the crime, leaving behind just enough clues to tantalize investigators but never enough to reveal the full picture. The meticulousness suggested not a random act of violence but the work of someone calculating, experienced and disturbingly patient. Despite the mounting pressure, Stafford County's police department remained committed. Days and nights blurred into one another as detectives pored over evidence, retracing Jacqueline's steps, interviewing friends and family multiple times, and coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions in case the killer had left the county. Each hour brought new frustrations, leads that went nowhere, testimonies that contradicted each other, and forensic analyses that produced no definitive results. The case began to take a personal toll on the investigators, who struggled to reconcile their desire for justice with the slow-moving reality of the investigation. Sleep became a luxury, tension an omnipresent companion, and the fear that the killer might strike again grew heavier with every passing day. It was within this climate of fear and uncertainty that the story took an even darker turn. In the summer of 1989, 3 years after Jacqueline's murder, Amy Baker, a young woman with an ordinary life, disappeared under circumstances that immediately drew comparisons to the previous tragedy. Like Jacqueline, Amy was in her early 20s, living quietly in Stafford County, and known for her warmth and friendliness. She had friends, family, and a job that gave her purpose and structure, much like Jacqueline had. On the evening she vanished, the community once again felt the chill of fear. People remembered Jacqueline's story all too well, and the eerie similarities between the two cases sent a shiver down the spine of everyone involved. Amy's disappearance mirrored Jacqueline's in uncanny ways. She had been last seen walking home from work, her route familiar and safe. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. Yet when she failed to return home that night, concern quickly turned to panic. The investigation began almost immediately, with officers revisiting methods and strategies used in Jacqueline's case. They scoured surveillance footage, canvassed the neighborhood, and interviewed friends and family. Every question, every lead, was weighted with the knowledge that a repeat of history might be unfolding. The community braced itself for the possibility that Stafford County had a predator walking among them, someone whose violence had gone unchecked for years. As detectives compared the two cases, the parallels became increasingly disturbing. Both women had been targeted in their own homes or on familiar routes. Both had no apparent enemies, and both crimes involved a level of precision that suggested a cold, calculated mind behind the actions. Even small details, the timing of the crimes, the way evidence seemed deliberately left to confuse investigators, pointed to the possibility that the same individual might be responsible. Stafford County residents began to grasp the chilling truth. This was not a series of random, isolated events. There was a pattern, and that pattern hinted at a predator who had studied the community, understood its rhythms, and exploited its trust. Public fear reached a peak as media coverage intensified. Newspapers and local television reports ran daily updates, speculating on connections between Jacqueline's murder and Amy's disappearance. Residents feared leaving their homes alone, and social gatherings carried an undercurrent of anxiety, as if everyone were watching for something that might never come. Law enforcement faced increasing pressure to act quickly, balancing the need for thorough investigation with the growing demands of a panicked public. Every tip was scrutinized, every suspicious sighting investigated, yet for all their efforts, progress was slow. The sense of urgency was palpable. The county could not afford to lose another life, and yet the mystery remained as complex and frustrating as ever. Detectives began to explore psychological profiles, considering the possibility that the perpetrator had traits of a serial offender. Meticulous planning, ability to blend into society, and a complete lack of remorse. They revisited witnesses who had initially seemed irrelevant, dug into criminal records, and analyzed behavioral patterns. Slowly, connections emerged, small threads that suggested a broader network of activity. These insights, while promising, were just the beginning. The case demanded patience, skill, and relentless attention to detail, as any misstep could allow the predator to continue unhindered. The impact on the community was profound. Families reevaluated their sense of security. Friendships were colored by fear, and everyday routines were disrupted by the shadow of potential violence. Jacqueline's murder had left a scar, but Amy's disappearance transformed that scar into an open wound. Stafford County realized that the threat was not confined to a single night, a single victim, or a single house. It was a lingering presence, invisible yet palpable, reminding everyone that danger could strike anywhere at any time. The memory of Jacqueline and the uncertainty surrounding Amy fueled a growing determination among both law enforcement and residents to uncover the truth, even as the county struggled with the emotional toll of repeated tragedy. Months of investigation following Amy's disappearance slowly began to produce leads, albeit ones that were tenuous and difficult to verify. Officers retraced Amy's final steps, looked for connections between her daily routine and those of Jacqueline, and considered every possible link. Interviews were repeated, alibis checked, and evidence analyzed with new technological methods where possible. As the patterns between the two cases became more apparent, a sense of grim determination settled over the detectives. They understood that solving this mystery was not only about justice for Jacqueline and Amy, but about preventing future tragedy. The stakes had never been higher, and the pressure to catch the perpetrator grew with every passing day. In this tense atmosphere, Stafford County residents were forced to confront an unsettling truth. Evil could hide in plain sight. Jacqueline's murder and Amy's disappearance revealed vulnerabilities no one wanted to acknowledge, and the county learned that safety and routine offered no guarantees against violence. As investigators worked tirelessly to untangle the web connecting the two cases, the community braced itself for revelations that would change their perception of security, trust, and the fragile line between life and death. Stafford County had been thrust into the shadow of fear, and the search for answers became a test of resilience, patience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. By the summer of 1989, Stafford County had changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. The tight-knit community that had once felt secure now carried an invisible weight of fear. The shadows along the street seemed longer, the quiet of the night more ominous. Amy Baker's disappearance had stirred memories of Jacqueline Lard's murder 3 years prior, and the parallels were impossible to ignore. Residents whispered about the similarities, noting the eerily familiar circumstances. Both young women had been kind, outgoing, and well-liked, living ordinary lives that had been violently disrupted. Both had vanished without warning, and both left behind homes and neighborhoods that should have been safe. The similarities suggested a predator who was deliberate, calculating, and terrifyingly patient, a presence that had eluded detection for years. Detectives approached Amy's case with the hard-earned lessons from Jacqueline's murder fresh in mind. The memory of the previous investigation, with its countless dead ends and unanswered questions, fueled a renewed determination to find the truth. Officers meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence, from Amy's final known whereabouts to the subtle details of her home environment. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, not only about the night of her disappearance but also about unusual occurrences in the weeks leading up to it. Odd behaviors that might have seemed insignificant at the time were now examined through a lens sharpened by experience and fear. Neighbors recalled a car parked near Amy's house late at night, a figure seen walking quietly along familiar paths, a sense of being watched that had initially been dismissed. Each recollection, no matter how small, was now treated as a potential key to unlocking the mystery. As detectives dug deeper, the parallels between the two cases became impossible to ignore. The similarities went beyond circumstance. Both women had been targeted in ways that suggested someone had studied their routines, understood their habits, and waited for the right moment to strike. The precision of the crimes indicated a level of planning that went far beyond opportunistic violence. Investigators began to construct a psychological profile, attempting to understand the mind of a perpetrator who could operate in plain sight, striking fear into ordinary lives while leaving behind a carefully curated trail of misdirection. The profile suggested a predator who was methodical, intelligent, and patient, someone who could live among unsuspecting neighbors without drawing attention, someone who understood the dynamics of suburban life and exploited them with chilling effectiveness. Public concern reached unprecedented levels. Media coverage intensified, with newspapers, radio, and local television reporting daily updates. Stafford County residents were gripped by fear, and every report about Amy's disappearance brought back memories of Jacqueline's murder. Schools implemented additional safety measures. Parents drove their children to and from activities rather than letting them walk alone, and community gatherings were approached with heightened caution. The idea that someone capable of harming young women with such precision could still be at large was deeply unsettling. Families were forced to examine their routines, to question the people they trusted, and to accept that safety was not guaranteed even in familiar surroundings. The investigation began to uncover subtle, previously overlooked connections. Detectives revisited Jacqueline's case files, looking for threads that might link the two events. Odd sightings near Jacqueline's home in 1986, which had been dismissed at the time, were reconsidered. Neighbors recalled unusual behavior: a car parked at the edge of the street, a stranger asking peculiar questions, a shadow glimpsed through the trees. These small details, when compared to Amy's case, suggested a continuity of behavior, a repeated pattern that was impossible to ignore. Evidence that once seemed isolated now formed a disturbing narrative, hinting at the presence of a single individual operating over several years, learning, adapting, and exploiting weaknesses in the community. The forensic side of the investigation also began to offer faint glimmers of hope. Hair samples, fibers, and other trace evidence collected from both Jacqueline's and Amy's scenes were re-examined with advances in scientific methods. Detectives worked with forensic specialists to compare materials, hoping to uncover connections that had been invisible in earlier examinations. Even minute details such as the type of fibers or the pattern of disturbances in the homes were analyzed for significance. While these findings were incremental, they provided a foundation for understanding the predator's methods and behavior, creating a roadmap that could eventually lead to identification and arrest. Witness accounts played a crucial role in the evolving investigation. Neighbors, friends, and family members were questioned extensively, not only about what they had seen or heard on the nights of the crimes, but also about seemingly ordinary interactions that might have held hidden significance. A neighbor's memory of a car idling late at night near both homes, a friend recalling a strange phone call, or a passerby noticing an unfamiliar figure. All these accounts became pieces of a larger puzzle. The detectives realized that the perpetrator had likely operated with caution and foresight, taking advantage of predictable routines and the community's inherent trust. Each new account was scrutinized, cross-referenced, and weighed against patterns from both cases. Slowly, the outlines of a potential suspect began to emerge. The mounting pressure on law enforcement was immense. The public demanded answers, the media pressed for developments, and families longed for closure. Detectives understood that every decision could have significant consequences. They balanced the urgency of finding the perpetrator against the need for thorough investigation, knowing that mistakes could allow the killer to continue targeting young women. The complexity of the investigation, combined with the emotional toll of revisiting these violent crimes, created a challenging environment. Yet the gravity of the situation inspired relentless effort, and the detectives' commitment never wavered. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued with painstaking care, as they sought to prevent further tragedy and bring justice to Jacqueline and Amy. As patterns became clearer, Stafford County residents began to realize the horrifying possibility that the same individual had committed both crimes. The idea that a predator could strike once and then remain undetected for years was deeply unsettling. People examined their surroundings differently, questioned the intentions of strangers, and became acutely aware of vulnerabilities that had once gone unnoticed. The notion that someone with knowledge, patience, and cunning could operate undetected in a familiar environment was terrifying, but it also galvanized the community to support law enforcement in any way possible. Vigilance, cooperation, and awareness became essential tools in the fight against the invisible threat. The psychological impact on investigators was profound. The detectives working the cases faced the dual challenge of processing horrific crime scenes while maintaining focus on the connections between them. They grappled with the idea that a person capable of such calculated violence could have continued to live among them for years, observing the community, learning its rhythms, and exploiting its trust. The pressure was both professional and personal, as officers were acutely aware that failing to apprehend the perpetrator could result in more victims. The stakes had never been higher, and the sense of urgency propelled the investigation forward with relentless momentum. Over time, the emerging picture of the killer became chillingly clear. Both Jacqueline and Amy had been targeted in ways that suggested not only opportunity, but meticulous planning. Their routines had been studied, vulnerabilities identified, and trust exploited. The crimes were not impulsive or random. They were deliberate, calculated, and executed with precision. Stafford County was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The perpetrator had likely been watching, waiting, and learning for years, adapting strategies to avoid detection while satisfying a hidden, destructive intent. The pattern was unmistakable, and the detective's task became not only identifying the killer, but understanding the psychology that had driven such heinous acts. As the investigation reached this critical juncture, Stafford County teetered between fear and hope. Fear because the pattern suggested a calculated predator operating undetected for years, and hope because the repeated similarities also offered clues, tangible threads that, if followed carefully, could lead to identification and capture. Each discovery, no matter how small, strengthened the resolve of law enforcement and the community. The lessons learned from Jacqueline's murder were now instrumental in guiding the investigation of Amy's case, and the potential to solve both crimes became increasingly attainable. By the end of 1989, the connection between Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker had transformed from speculation into a compelling theory. Investigators had identified patterns of behavior, geographic consistencies, and psychological tendencies that suggested a single perpetrator. Stafford County residents were acutely aware of the danger that had loomed over them for years, yet the emerging clarity offered a glimmer of hope. The predator could be caught, the cycle of violence could be broken, and justice could finally be served. The stage was set for a breakthrough, and both the community and law enforcement braced for the revelations that would soon follow, knowing that the next steps would define the legacy of these tragic cases and the safety of the county itself. Investigation into Amy Baker's disappearance and Jacqueline Lard's murder had stretched Stafford County to its limits, testing the patience, skill, and resilience of law enforcement while casting a long shadow over the community. By late 1989, the threads connecting the two cases had become undeniable. Detectives had painstakingly compiled evidence, re-examined old files, interviewed countless witnesses, and revisited every overlooked detail. What had once seemed like isolated tragedies was now recognized as the work of a calculating predator. Someone who had carefully studied the county, understood its rhythms, and exploited the trust of its residents with chilling precision. Stafford County held its collective breath, knowing that the next breakthrough could either bring justice or reveal the depths of a danger still lurking among them. The breakthrough came from a combination of luck, vigilance, and meticulous detective work. A neighbor's seemingly minor observation, a car repeatedly parked near both victims' homes at unusual hours, was finally matched with license plate records and cross-referenced with other minor reports that had been dismissed in both cases. Investigators also revisited forensic evidence from Jacqueline's murder, using new methods that had advanced in the intervening years. Fibers, trace hairs, and other microscopic details, previously considered inconclusive, began to reveal connections. Small, almost imperceptible patterns in behavior emerged. A particular route the perpetrator had taken, a preference for certain times of day, and subtle methods of entry that spoke to a sophisticated understanding of suburban routines. Each piece added weight to the growing hypothesis that one person had committed both crimes, leaving only the smallest footprints of their malevolent presence behind. The community, meanwhile, remained on edge. Stafford County residents were hyper-aware, locking doors during the day, checking on neighbors, and questioning strangers who passed through their streets. The repeated targeting of young women in similar circumstances had shattered the sense of security the county had long taken for granted. Yet amidst this tension, there was a sense of shared purpose. Parents, friends, and neighbors rallied around law enforcement, offering tips, memories, and observations that might otherwise have been overlooked. Vigilance became a collective effort, with the entire county tacitly acknowledging that solving these cases required both professional skill and community cooperation. Detectives began focusing on behavioral patterns that suggested more than just opportunity. Both Jacqueline and Amy had been targeted in ways that indicated prior knowledge of their routines, implying that the perpetrator had spent time observing them. This observation extended to details like when they left for work, what time they returned home, and even small habits that could have made them vulnerable. The psychological profile that emerged painted a portrait of a predator who was patient, calculating, and remorseless, someone who derived satisfaction from control and precision rather than brute force alone. Understanding this psychological dimension became critical to predicting future behavior and identifying the individual responsible. Critical piece of the puzzle emerged when a tip came from a longtime resident who recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure in the neighborhood years earlier, behaving oddly around both areas where the victims lived. The person had asked questions that at the time seemed innocuous, but in retrospect indicated an unnerving level of interest in the victim's routines. Law enforcement followed this lead meticulously, cross-checking it against past reports, vehicle registrations, and criminal records. The combination of community memory, forensic evidence, and investigative diligence began to narrow the suspect pool, creating a tangible pathway toward resolution. As the investigation progressed, detectives worked to anticipate the perpetrator's next move. They reviewed case files for every similar crime in surrounding counties, looking for behavioral patterns, geographic overlaps, and unexplained absences. Each connection brought the investigators closer to understanding the methods and mindset of someone who had managed to evade capture for years. The realization that the killer had been operating undetected instilled urgency, a pressure that sharpened the team's focus but also highlighted the stakes. Another missed opportunity could result in further tragedy. Eventually, the efforts paid off. Surveillance footage combined with tip lines and witness statements pointed toward a suspect whose demeanor in public life had masked a dark and hidden world. Law enforcement identified someone who had consistently remained on the periphery of both victims' lives, a figure who had moved quietly through the community, earning trust and avoiding suspicion. Detectives secured search warrants, reviewed personal histories, and cross-referenced alibis with crime scene evidence. Each new discovery reinforced the pattern. This was the same person responsible for both Jacqueline Lard's murder and Amy Baker's abduction. The suspect's careful planning, patience, and methodical execution became horrifyingly clear, underscoring the danger that had existed in plain sight for years. When the arrest was made, it sent shockwaves through Stafford County. Neighbors, friends, and family members struggled to reconcile the calm, seemingly ordinary individual with the sinister acts revealed by the investigation. The confession and corroborating evidence revealed a level of calculation that was difficult for the public to comprehend. The perpetrator had exploited trust, blended seamlessly into the community, and orchestrated violence with precision, leaving both families devastated, but also providing a measure of closure. The relief that justice was finally being served was tempered by the horror of what had occurred. A chilling reminder of the capacity for evil to exist where it is least expected. For the families of Jacqueline and Amy, the resolution was bittersweet. The arrest did not bring back their loved ones, nor could they erase the pain and trauma caused by the murders. Yet they offered a sense of justice, a recognition that law enforcement's perseverance had prevented further harm. Funerals and memorials provided moments for the community to grieve, reflect, and support one another, reinforcing the bonds that had been tested by fear and tragedy. Stafford County, scarred but resilient, began the slow process of healing, carrying with it the memory of what had been lost and the knowledge that vigilance and justice could coexist. Even in the shadow of such darkness, the case left a lasting imprint on law enforcement practices in Stafford County. Investigators reviewed the timeline of both murders, analyzing procedural successes and failures, and implementing new methods for responding to missing persons and violent crimes. The lessons learned became part of the county's law enforcement framework, emphasizing the importance of community cooperation, early intervention, and meticulous attention to seemingly minor details. Detectives who had worked the case reflected on the painstaking effort required to bring resolution, understanding that persistence, patience, and rigorous analysis were essential in confronting a predator who had previously operated with near impunity. For the community, the story of Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker became a cautionary tale but also a testament to resilience. Families and neighbors remained vigilant, but learned to reclaim a sense of normalcy, balancing awareness with the recognition that life could not be lived in constant fear. The memory of the victims was honored through local initiatives aimed at improving community safety, fostering support networks, and educating residents about personal security. Stafford County's response became an example of how a community could endure tragedy, confront fear, and emerge stronger, even in the face of extraordinary darkness. As years passed, the case continued to resonate. True crime researchers, journalists, and law enforcement professionals studied it for its complexity, the psychological profile of the perpetrator, and the persistence required to solve it. The narrative of Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker became more than a historical account. It became a lesson in vigilance, the unpredictable nature of human behavior, and the relentless pursuit of justice. For the families who had endured unimaginable loss, for the detectives who had committed years of effort, and for the community that had been tested to its limits, the resolution represented the triumph of perseverance over malevolence. In the end, Stafford County emerged scarred but enlightened. Jacqueline's bright life and Amy's potential future were stolen, but their stories forced a reckoning with the hidden dangers of seemingly safe communities and inspired reforms that would protect countless others. The arrest of the killer brought a sense of closure, but also a lingering awareness that evil can exist in plain sight, masked by ordinariness and patience. The story concluded not with complete relief but with a powerful understanding